Hi, this is Gary Sheffer. I'm a trustee of the Hudson Area Library, and I also work with our history room. The Hudson Library is unique in many ways in that we have a sort of a little museum and archive attached to our library. And so during this period where the library is closed, unfortunately, due to coronavirus, we're trying to move some of our programming online. And one of the things we wanted to do was talk to people in the community about the history of Hudson. And we're going to post this on the library's website. And so we're going to do a series of these over the next few weeks. And our first victim is Peter Cipkowski, who is known to many of the folks, supporters of the History Room. Peter's done some History Room talks for us on the period of urban renewal in Hudson back in the 1970 time frame. Peter is the supervisor of the town of Hillsdale. Are you still you're also president of the Roeliff Jansen Historical Society as well, Peter? Is
No
that
longer, no.
no longer? Oh, well, Peter's
They threw me out a couple of years ago.
Peter's a fan of history, and he has a great story, many great stories about his family and their connection to Front Street in Hudson. So I wanted to chat with Peter for a little while about that. Peter, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure. It's a delightful idea. I hope your viewers will find this interesting.
So now tell me, Peter, your background and where you grew up, and then we'll move into your connection to Hudson.
Sure. I grew up here, just down the street above a bar in Copic Falls. My father was a Hudson native, and he and my mom bought an old inn in Copic Falls that's still there, still managed by my brother. And went to Roeliff Jansen School and Taconic Hills, and got the hell out of town as quickly as I could when I was 17, and here I am.
Here you are back. So it was your grandfather, if I can have this right, Peter, and it's Joseph Cipkowski, who owned the market at 39 South Front Street. Is that right? And
That's
so were they immigrants to Hudson and of course to the States?
Yeah, so my father and my grandfather are both Joseph, so it may be confusing. But my grandfather Joseph, or Yusef,
Yeah,
he came to the U.S. in 1912 as a boy. He was born in 1900, and they settled in Jersey City. I'm not sure how much detail you want me to give, but they settled there, and he was the oldest of a large family, and as a young man, I think of 15, had to leave home to make his way.
Okay.
And he ended up coming up the river on the railroad.
Is that right? And did he immediately open a market, or did he do other things before Chip's Market?
Yeah, he like a lot of other Polish immigrants in our area, they tended the orchards on in the Hudson Valley.
Sure.
My grandfather had come from a farming family in Poland and had some expertise, so he joined some orchards in the Livingston area in the same way that we know that some Italians were working on the railroad, and the Irish, I think, had come here a little bit earlier, and African Americans in Hudson at the time were working in the very difficult task of moving the coal around from one.
Exactly. Yes, my grandfather was Italian, and he came and worked in the quarry at about the same time period as your grandfather came to Hudson as well. So when does South Front Street begin to become part of the family?
In 1926. In 1926, well, that's when my grandfather purchased the Arrowhead store that became Chip's Market.
Okay.
My grandmother was born on Cross Street.
Okay.
And she and her mom and sister Sophie lived down there. Her mom had a boarding house on Allen Street, a building that's still there. But she met my grandfather around 1925.
Okay.
When he basically segued from working in the orchards to working at the local cement plant.
Right. And which plant? Do you know, Peter, which plant it was?
I believe it was called Lone Star at the time.
Lone Star, sure. Yeah, there were a couple.
He lived, there were a couple, and he lived in those buildings that are right on Worth Avenue, that cluster of workmen's housing.
Oh, sure.
He lived there with a buddy of his, several buddies, I believe, who all worked in the plant.
Okay. So then he buys the market, right? Arrowhead. And so tell me the pronunciation. I said Chips Market. Is it pronounced differently? Is it?
That's correct. Chips with 2 P's for whatever
Okay.
reason. Yeah, that was the sign, and that was the place down at South Front Street.
So it was at South Front and what they called Fleet Street, I believe, at the time, right, Peter? Was a little road that carried a bridge over extension of partition, and one of those streets down there carried a bridge over the railroad tracks, I thought.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in the same way that we know of Ferry Street, going over the tracks down to the river, still closed, of course. There was a parallel or comparable little bridge that was a continuation of Partition Street, and it ran on the north side of what was called Franklin Square. And my grandfather's shop was right on the corner of South Front and Fleet Street, facing the square, facing South Front.
Right. So now you come on the scene, right? And so you begin to spend some time down there. You're living out in Hillsdale, right? And growing up there, but you spend a lot of time down at your grandfather's.
Yeah, so before we actually moved to the inn, we were living on Cape Cod. My mother was a Cape native, and they brought us down to the Cape. My oldest brother was born on South Front Street, and they opened up the Half Moon restaurant, a bar, that my father built right after World War II. In any event, my mother felt that they needed to get down to the Cape to raise the family, and we came back, my older brothers and sisters, to Hudson all the time, every Easter, certainly frequently to Hudson in the 60s as a boy.
Okay.
And by just around the time we moved to Copic Falls, urban renewal came through and wiped out South Front Street.
Okay. So tell me about what you remember about the market. In other words, who were the customers? What did they sell? And what was your favorite thing that was for sale in that market?
Oh, that's easy. I mean, as a kid, it was Yahoo, right? The chocolate milk and penny candy. It was penny candy. My grandfather had a big penny candies case, even though there was a much revered penny candy store up on the 100th block, as you know.
Exactly.
But, it was an exotic place. Whenever we came up from the Cape, which was somewhat remote in those days as kids, it was a place that was filled with all kinds of amazing flavors. I'm talking about a lot of Italian and Ukrainian and Polish, African American. Churches were full, and it was just a place we could walk around safely and feel kind of overwhelmed by the variety of people who lived in this place. It was just very unlike my childhood on Cape Cod with my mother's very, very Yankee parents. So it was exotic, and people used different languages, and my goodness, it was also a little risque from time to time. So
that's right. It could be, and you're right down there near the train station, so there's a lot of activity. And was it a Polish? Did the market cater to the Polish population, or was it just a general store?
Yeah, it was pretty diverse, as a matter of fact. There were a lot of Black folks who came in and out, and I certainly remember Italians and Ukrainians as well. My parents were Roman Catholic, and they went to the Polish church, but also from time to time to the Orthodox church just up the street.
Sure.
A mishmash. Italian. No, it was, certainly there were grocers and butchers on virtually every block in Hudson in those days. This was a real neighborhood blend. I have to say, it was a real medley of the kinds of folks that were there.
Now, did your grandfather run the market until the end of his life, or did it pass in the family, or what was the sort of the history of that?
Yeah, so my grandfather bought it from a woman when it was had previously been called, I believe, the Russian Home. I believe she had a boarding house upstairs, but there was some kind of grocery downstairs, according to the records that I've seen.
Okay.
He bought it, started his family, raised his family there, and it was the family home for my grandfather, grandmother, until 1970 when urban renewal came through.
Right.
So my grandfather, you know, like a lot of other people who benefited, benefited from urban renewal, bought a lovely home outside Hudson, in his case in Claverack, and lived there briefly before selling it and moving into the inn with us in Copic Falls.
Oh, and that's nice.
It was
Oh,
fantastic.
that's fantastic. So can you tell me about the transaction? In other words, that during that era when most of that block on that, I guess would be the west side of Front, was demolished. Was it something that was, did he have a decision in that, Peter? In other words, do you have records that show, was there negotiations between your grandfather and the city about whether he would sell or not?
I don't have any records about my grandfather's position on this, but I have recollections that he and my grandmother thought this was a good plan. My grandfather was 70 in 1970. It was time for them to retire.
Sure.
My grandmother, however, signed a petition that I have a copy of that was circulated in early 1970 when there was suddenly a kind of a bit of an uprising, a grassroots movement among some folks to slow the plan to take down South Front Street because of its historic value. But the petition was signed by virtually every resident in South Front Street, including my grandmother, saying, heck no, give us the check, we're ready to move on. That was a very different time, and I know this may be a different conversation for us to have, but urban renewal at the time was seen as a positive step for the people of Hudson.
Progress was seen as progress, definitely.
Yeah, that's right.
So now you've made available, I'd like to ask you about some family movies that you found. Did you discover them or did your grandfather pass them on, and they show life in that, I think it was like 39 to 54, those years, life on South Front. Where did those come from, Peter?
Yeah, my grandfather and father were avid, just amateur photographers, videographers, and so on. And I remember growing up and watching these remarkable movies, my parents' wedding day, all these amazing scenes of Hudson, of all these amazing characters. My aunt, her name was Patty Chip. A lot of old Hudsonians remember Patty Chip because she was a larger than life figure on South Front Street. My father's youngest sister. She valued these old 16 millimeter and 8 millimeter things and put them away. And upon her death, I nabbed them and digitized them and put them all up on YouTube and have shared them with a lot of folks. I believe the History Room has virtually a complete set of salvageable.
And I suggest anybody who wants to see sort of life on South Front Street, which you can't, the buildings are gone. They're terrific. We actually showed them, Peter, at our little History Room storefront on the Winter Walk, and people sat and watched them. They were fascinated with them, and I highly recommend it for folks who are interested in the history of Hudson.
Yeah, and just so that you know, the version that you all have, the version that I've posted, is a kind of edited. It's sort of like, these are family home movies, so there's a focus on, the cast of characters in my family, the neighbors that my grandfather took pictures of, people walking by, that kind of thing. So, but whenever there was footage of an interesting building over the corner or the occasional parade, I made that all available. But all the original film is in the possession of the History Room as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Some great memories for me of the soapbox derby in those. So those are fantastic. Now, your uncle Edward Cipkowski was on the staff, right, of the Urban Renewal Agency, the Hudson Urban. Right. So you've given talks at the library about that era, which is so interesting. Was it because of your uncle? How did you get interested in that, Peter?
Oh, I've always been obsessed with history and with local history and with Hudson. And I think because I have a deep emotional attachment to my grandparents and admired them very much. And, I ended up going to Poland for graduate school because of my experience with my exposure to the Polish community in Hudson as a kid. It's a fascinating period. I feel it's sort of misjudged in many ways. It's a complicated period.
Yes.
I'm someone who believes historically that it's important to sort of see both sides of the story to understand it, without judgment.
Right.
It just fascinates me. And I had these interesting primary source materials from my uncle, as well as access to the collection in Hudson.
Right. No, and a lot of those files are in the basement of the Chamber of Commerce building, right? At the foot of Warren Street, the old Urban Renewal Agency records.
They were a couple of years ago. I hope they're still there.
Okay. Excellent. Well, this is fascinating, Peter, really. And I'd love to talk to you again about your urban, your knowledge about that era. And I was fascinated to see on the presentation that you did where you marked out the blocks on the sort of the aerial photo of Hudson, which the blocks that were removed, the buildings that were removed. And it gives people a real understanding of that era and the decision-making that went into your point that drove it. And it was seen as progress at the time. And full disclosure here, my grandfather was the mayor of Hudson at that time, Elmer Sheffer. So he was involved in a lot of that. Well, thank you for doing this, Peter. I really, really appreciate it. And good luck with everything you're doing out there in Hillsdale during this crazy period.
Thanks so much, Gary, and thanks so much to the History Room for this endeavor. This is great. Thank you.
Terrific. Take care.
Bye now.